All right, well, I'm going to get us started here. My name's Mike Peralski. I am the Director of Student Services for the Wauwatosa School District, and I am really thankful to have each of our community members join me on our mental health panel and format for our parents this evening. I'm also thrilled with the participation and attendance that we continue to get from our students and families. So what I'm going to do for right now is I am going to share my screen and get us started with our presentation. For this evening, as I said, being the Director of Student Services, I have a pretty broad job as far as what my responsibilities are. But if I really want to narrow down the focus, my job is to make sure that 100% of our kids get the best possible experience that they can have in the Wauwatosa School District. And I know I put the picture, I think it's of my daughter in senior kindergarten, so it's not this year. But I know one thing that always grounds and helps me is I often think about how would I want things handled for my own child? How would I want that situation to be handled? What kind of impact or expectations would I have in even some of the most sensitive or difficult situations? I know this year in 2020, being a parent, an educator, but most importantly, what I have to focus on is our students. School has been a tremendous challenge in the midst of a global pandemic. There are so many unknowns, high level of fear, and a lot of new tasks for all of us to do to prepare just for sometimes the most basic of tasks. And thinking about all of this, I know, can make us feel overwhelmed and can add to a high level of stress. My goal for this evening and why I am so thankful for the community support as well as the expertise of our panelists is to help you as parents add to your toolbox to find some manageable ways to work through this, to support your children and to make sure that everybody is happy and healthy and able to move forward in a positive way as we navigate our school experience. One thing I did want to bring up is our original presentation was meant to be last week, Wednesday, and we did reschedule it in light of uncertainty in our community that impacted all of us, able to move forward in a positive way as we navigate our school experience. One thing I did want to bring up is our original presentation was meant to be last week, Wednesday, and we did reschedule it in light of uncertainty in our community that impacted all of us. And
Mike, I just wanted to jump in for a sec. You may want to hit present.
Oh.
So it goes full screen for everyone.
Thank you.
Right, on the right, top right.
Thank you. One thing that I just wanted to bring up was obviously in light of the Mensa decision last week, we knew that there would be a lot of pain, hurt, frustration, and even fear, which did lead to multiple nights of civil unrest in our community. However, in the Wauwatosa School District, our commitment has always been to align to our three strategic goals, and really at this time, really to focus on our second, which is to make sure that we are a place that welcomes and supports all children, staff, and families. Our response the last couple of days has really been to make sure that we remain student-centered and that we're focused on the emotional well-being of our students, educators, and our families. I'm sure that all of you in some way have probably seen messaging from our district leaders and building leaders around the following. We care about and we love your students. We are going to continue to practice and work on our empathy. We are going to listen. And also an acknowledgement that learning was challenging and may continue to be challenging in the near future. Tonight, though, the one thing I really wanted us to focus on and have our panelists dive in is I appreciate we had around 30 plus questions that were submitted, and our panelists were able to really pull out key themes, concerns that multiple people wanted to hear more about as far as the return to school and concerns that they might either have about their children or even sometimes their own stress and well-being. And really what I want to say is it for us as a learning community in the Wauwatosa School District, this is something that really means a lot to us this year. We want to work with and acknowledge the whole child, and we want to make sure that we have safe and supportive and equitable learning environments where our students feel like they belong and they have these consistent and meaningful opportunities to work on their social emotional skills. And that's why I'm thrilled this evening to have the expertise that we have in the room. And I will let them each, when they kind of come on and do their part, give just a brief overview of who they are and what their role is. But again, I really do appreciate our panelists for the time they put together, or the time they invested to put this together for this evening. So thank you, and I will have us get started.
Thanks so much, Mike. So just a brief introduction. My name is Heidi Hemling. I am a psychotherapist here in Tosa. I have a private practice called The Holding Space. Some of you may know the location. I'm on the Tosa Peds campus, and so I'm fortunate to work with the doctors there as well as lots of others in the community. I think just a couple of things as we're kind of getting started. So I'd like to walk everyone through this general framework that we have. As Mike mentioned, we had lots of questions that came in. We're so thankful for the participation of parents and other grown-ups in our kids' lives. We know that parents take many forms these days. So for clarity's sake, we'll probably use the phrase parents most often in our presentations tonight, but we understand that that can mean grandparents and other types of guardians and caregivers. So we want everyone to feel included and acknowledged. So again, some of those themes as we walked through the questions and we were able to pull are things like adversity and resilience, social emotional support in school. So what does that look like? What are we doing inside the schools with our kiddos during the day? Other important considerations, especially on the school level, academic achievement and what that looks like in light of COVID-19 and the changes that we've had to our learning environments, not just this year, but also last spring. Structure, social connectedness, also important things to be considering. What do those look like inside of school as well as outside of school? For kids who are in Tosa Connected or Tosa Virtual Academy, these are things that we want to be considering. How do we provide the support? Other large themes, regression and behavior management, protective factors or signs for concern. So how do we decipher between stress and anxiety? How do we decipher between sadness and depression? What are signs that you can look for, coping skills that you can implement at home? And when do you know that you need to reach out for additional support, whether it's through student services in the school, in the community, your pediatrician? So we'll give lots of resources for that support at the end of the presentation as well. And another really huge theme that we saw coming through in almost every question was this idea of parent anxiety. What are the things that we can do to make sure that our kids are successful this year? How do we know when they need help? What if they're not asking for it? What do we watch for? And how do we cope as parents? So those are kind of all the themes that we were able to pull from the questions. But if we can just take one step back, I think it'd be really great if we all just kind of take a deep breath together. I know it's probably been a really busy day. Maybe your kids are in bed, maybe they're not. Maybe you're putting them to bed and you are listening on your phone, However that looks for you, we're so thankful and grateful that you're here and you're participating. We value your time and we're happy to share all of these things with you. So if we can just kind of take that deep breath together, maybe take a moment of mindfulness to just sort of shake off the day so we can really make the most of the time that we have together. We will be giving you lots of information and lots of resources in a short amount of time. And we want to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves while you're receiving all of this. The other thing that I want to touch on that I think is probably a theme you will see throughout the entire presentation and maybe talked about a little bit less specifically, but is definitely present, and that is grief and loss and how that kind of creates this perfect storm of anxiety. If you can think back to March when COVID-19 started, everything sort of canceled, right? Schools were closed. Suddenly, our calendars just were wiped clean overnight. And maybe for a little while, it was really jarring. And maybe for a little while, it was kind of nice to slow down. But then the reality of what we've been trying to navigate settles in. And we see it settling into ourselves, into our kiddos, into our families. We're missing loved ones. We're missing social connection. Jobs look different. So many things changed. And these things were out of our control. And it makes absolute sense that there would be some grief that comes along with that and feelings of loss that really need to be processed. Sometimes grief and loss are not feelings that we like to process. They're uncomfortable, they're painful. And there, I think sometimes it's just sort of a natural inclination to sort of push those down. It's okay, we can get through this, we're in survival mode, I don't have time to acknowledge that. And all of those things are understandable and okay. But even if it's just for a little while tonight within the space of this presentation, I wonder if you might just be able to start to pay attention to where those things have settled inside of you and maybe within your family. Acknowledging them and saying, yeah, we are missing a lot of things. This has been really hard, and yet we can do hard things. We are strong enough. And we hope, I think, as presenters, that we'll be able to kind of give you some of those coping skills to deal with the anxiety that comes along with some of that grief and loss and the difficulty that sometimes exists when we are working to process those things. As we move forward, again, we're going to kind of go through all of these themes that we were able to pull from all of your wonderful questions. And I think I will turn it over to Jenny now, and she will start with adversity and resilience and talk through some of the things specific to that.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Jenny Hoig, and as a brief introduction, I am a pediatric psychologist. I work for the Medical College of Wisconsin, but I work specifically in the Mac Fund Center at Children's Hospital. So my everyday job is to work with children and families who are impacted by pediatric cancer. So I feel that this talking about adversity and resilience is something that's sort of near and dear to my heart and part of what I see every day. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of the research behind adversity and resilience, provide you with some strategies to help build resilience in your kids, and then talk about what each of those things are. So just to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page, when we talk about adversity, what we mean is a specific risk factor that an individual experiences that may or may not be preventable. So in this case, when we started talking or creating this presentation, it was really specifically about COVID-19 and what this has meant to our kids. So the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say, represents adversity that is chronic. It's not kind of a one-time traumatic event, but it's going on for several months. It is ongoing, and it impacts day-to-day life. I would also kind of put into this category in our community now, the civil unrest that is happening is sort of another adverse event or another type of adversity that our kids are experiencing. So just as there are really wide variability in the types of traumatic events that children can be exposed to, there's also fairly wide variation in children's psychological outcomes following a trauma. I think most of us are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and that's the first thing that we think about when we think about exposure to traumatic events in childhood. However, I think it's important to recognize that post-traumatic stress disorder is a fairly rare, or probably more likely incredibly rare disorder, and much more likely what you will see in your home as your kids experience adversity are other symptom clusters, things like acting out and regressing, and those are all things we're going to be talking about tonight. Some of these symptoms will persist over time, although for the most part, we do expect that most of them will dissipate as we get farther away from the traumatic event. So unfortunately, for a trauma or adversity like COVID-19 that goes on for many months, we would expect that those responses to the adversity would continue for that period of time as well. There are different risks or vulnerabilities that influence subsequent poor adjustment to adversity. Those at an individual level would be things like previous exposure to trauma, ongoing exposure to trauma, and that can be in real life, or it can just be through the media. So, one of the things that we certainly recommend is to monitor what your kids are seeing. If it doesn't have to be, if the news doesn't have to be playing while you're eating dinner, that's probably for the best, because that will reintroduce or bring back that adversity instead of it being a safe, protective space in your home. And then obviously children who are more directly impacted through loss or disruption are going to have more adversity or have a higher risk of poor adjustment to adversity. So if someone in your family is directly affected by COVID-19, or sort of worst case scenario, somebody dies that you know from COVID-19, that's going to be a higher risk factor for poor adjustment. At the family level, families that are characterized by conflict or chaos are at higher risk for poor adjustment. My house is fairly chaotic right now, so I don't sort of mean your day-to-day chaos, but more along the lines of domestic violence, or a really difficult marital situation, a parent who has significant mental health problems and isn't able to take care of themselves or the children. That would be sort of a chaos that we would be talking about. And then if we have poor parental functioning during times of stress, we would also anticipate that we would see poor child functioning. So essentially a traumatized parent is going to probably lead to a traumatized child. At the community level, we see sort of broad band things like poverty and racism, homelessness, or food insecurity as being risk factors for poor adjustment. The children and families that experience that level of vulnerability or risk are going to need pretty extraordinary support from their communities, schools, governments, humanitarian agencies in order to meet those acute challenges of the pandemic. So the good news is, because that was all really depressing, but the good news is despite the cascading challenges that we see through this disaster, through the COVID-19 disaster, which can feel incredibly overwhelming at times, there is fantastic research on human resilience, and that gives us hope about the eventual outcomes that we can expect in most children and families in the wake of this pandemic. So in the context of adversity, resilience is the capacity of an individual to recover their functioning after the cessation or the end of that traumatic event. I want to be very clear that resilience is about resisting psychopathology. It is not about displaying an unusually positive outcome. So these are not the kids who are, thriving under this circumstance, but really the kids who are continuing to sort of hang in there, essentially, as we go through everything. Important to note that resilience is not static, and it can change and fluctuate along with variables in the environment and in the child's life. There are factors that increase resilience or buffer children during times of adversity. At the individual level, that would be character traits like good sense of humor, being assertive or resourceful, or someone who is just already has good emotional regulation. Those are not necessarily characteristics that we can build in our children right now, though. So we'll talk about things that are a little bit more in your control, like family factors that can increase resilience. And those are families that are really characterized by parents who are able to monitor their children. So literally knowing where your children are at during the day, knowing who their friends are, who do they spend their time with. Those are important characteristics in buffering your children from adversity. Families that are characterized by the ability to have consistent parenting practice or setting limits is important, as are those that encourage skill development and problem solving, and parents who are warm and responsive and positively involved in their children's lives. Those are the kids who are much more likely to demonstrate resiliency. At the community level, we see things such as having solid peer support, having a caring child and teacher relationship, and then those kids who really feel a sense of belonging in their community. Again, more likely to buffer kids from adversity. There are some strategies that you can do right now to help your children learn to be more resilient, which may help them right now as we go through all of the adversity that this pandemic is bringing, but certainly will help them as they go through the rest of their lives. So for younger children, maintaining as much normalcy in your routine is really helpful. For older children, they really understand kind of the broader scope of the impact of this disaster. And some of them may be struggling with lost hope or feeling like their future is less secure because of what their community or what the world is experiencing right now. So for older kids, it's really crucial to help them restore that hope and to help them find a new pathway of opportunity for success. Also important to let children face uncertainty or discomfort and to allow them time and space to solve their problems independently. I know we all want to jump in and help our kids when they're struggling, but rescuing your child actually weakens their resiliency. As we mentioned before, when I talked about family factors that buffer kids, it's important to spend time with your children, ask them about their day, allow them to feel unconditionally supported. If they come to you with a problem, resist the urge to just talk at them and tell them what to do, but rather give them questions that kind of guide them to creating their own answer. Really important also to demonstrate coping skills. We are the models for our children, so if they see us modeling good coping, they're much more likely to do that themselves. It's also important to encourage healthy risk-taking. So we often think of risk-taking as being a negative, but this is really about pushing kids outside of their comfort zone. So try a new sport, message a new friend. When kids avoid risk, they really internalize the message that they aren't strong enough to handle the challenge. So let them be challenged and let them rise to that challenge. Also important to embrace mistakes, including your own. That really promotes a growth mindset, which is something that I think our elementary schools talk a lot about. And it gives kids the message that mistakes are normal and can help us learn. It can also be helpful to reframe difficult situations. That helps kids just increase optimism as they look at a problem from a different angle and see that something positive or good can come out of something very challenging. And then finally, spend time outside. Being outside and being physically active are all very helpful for mental health and build resiliency. I just want to go very, very quickly to talk about post-traumatic growth because I think this is what often people think resiliency is, but post-traumatic growth is sort of the next step, and it's not something that we anticipate happening for the majority of kids, but it is possible, and that is benefit finding. So that is having a positive psychological change, which you experience as a result of adversity. So you essentially are rising to a higher level of functioning. I do think we're seeing a little bit of this in small ways. A child who was maybe struggling in the school setting, once they had to do remote learning and they could learn at a more individualized pace of learning, perhaps there are kids out there who then felt a higher sense of self-efficacy or confidence. and became more persistent. So that would be an example of post-traumatic growth. But again, not something that we anticipate or expect for kids. What we're really looking at is building resiliency. Okay, next slide.
Hi, I'll reserve my intro for when I speak, but I just wanted to introduce the next section that we're doing. I've really enjoyed as a parent collaborating with our next two speakers, Sue Walzak and Kelly Karoy from Student Services. I have been so comforted to hear what they're doing for our students in schools, and I'm really excited that other parents also get to hear what's going on and how our students are being supported. Sue's going to start us off by talking about the behavioral, social, and emotional supports, and then Kelly will start with helping us understand what's happening in the area of academics, because that looks very different this school year. Sue?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Sue Walzak. I am a school social worker at Wilson W. STEM Elementary School. I am starting my 27th year in this wonderful community that I have chosen to spend my whole entire career at. And I am very proud of this slide. When I look at this slide, I think it really represents our district's commitment to not only academia, but the social emotional well-being of all of our students. And when this slide came out, I think a year or two ago, it, as a school social worker, it encompasses everything that I do for each and every student that I come in contact with. Next slide. So how do we support the social emotional growth, or that social emotional learning piece in our schools? So when we look at what social emotional learning is, it's really a process through which children acquire and apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage their own emotions, so self-regulation, to set and achieve goals, to feel and show empathy for others, and establish and maintain positive relationships. When we started off this school year, when we really truly looked at social emotional learning, what did that mean coming back after being off for so long, having kids in different sort of modalities of teaching, we really focused on relationship building. And that was kind of the key to start off the school year. The underlying theme that continues as we're sort of 6 weeks in. So when we look at social emotional learning, we sort of tier this. So the first tier is, what do all of our kids get? And that may come through curriculum, supports, and services. So this is accessible to all students. And then we look at tier 2. And those are students that are identified as maybe needing a little bit more than what the universal support services and curriculum we're giving. So this is really driven, student-driven, parent-driven. A staff member may recognize this. And then there are some data points that we look at to see who those students are that might need some support. And then finally, we sort of look at the tier 3, which is a very individualized interventions or supports for students. And so this too is driven by students, parents, staff members, and data. And when we enter sort of a tier 3 or individualized approach at SEL, we definitely enter a partnership with the child or the student to also be part of that process on what they need. Next slide. Okay, so just, I could talk on and on and on about what we're doing in schools for social emotional support. So this is really a brief snapshot. And so, when we look at the elementary level, so I'm sort of hitting on some of the things in the elementary level, we are very heavy in direct instruction and curriculum at the elementary level. We are building those foundational skills to move into the secondary level and into adolescence and young adulthood. So we're really sort of building those with direct instruction. I think that's really important to know that as kids go through our system, you'll see at the secondary level, there is still some curriculum and direct instruction and some of the SEL, but we're moving more to experiential growth and really practicing those foundational skills that we are getting our elementary kids. So when we look at SEL, we're looking at sort of 3 levels too. So what's happening in our classrooms, what's happening in our schools, and then what's happening in partnership out in our community and with our parent community. And so PBIS is sort of what is a system that we use within our school, a framework to kind of put all this together. So PBI stands for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support. We have been doing this in our district probably for 10 plus years. Different schools have different teams to have approaches on how we handle social, emotional, and behavioral growth in our buildings. So that is something that is in place and always happening, and that is meeting the needs of individual schools. One of the things at the elementary schools that most teachers have been doing, but more so this year, all kids are having morning meetings where they get to check in with their classmates. It is a chance for our students to build relationships, get to know each other, and then also to form sort of a community where they can talk about things. One of the things I do want to mention is our teachers are outstanding at teaching in the moment, not just with academics, but with things that come up in the classroom. So know that many things come up organically in conversations, and teachers are spot on with using those social, emotional, and behavioral situations for teachable moments. So I'm just gonna really quickly go through a couple curriculums that are very important at the elementary level for social emotional learning. The first is our second step curriculum. This is direct instruction from the teacher, where they really cover skills for learning, how to be a good learner, and then empathy. So we're not always born with empathy, and I think that in our relationships, we can see that not all people are empathetic people. We have the belief that we can teach empathy to kids, and they can start learning how to take perspectives at a very young age. And then the emotional management piece, so that self-regulation, how do I control my anger? How do I control my overexcitement to something that I really, really enjoy? And then lastly, problem solving. So these skills fit very nicely into the vision of a graduate and laying those foundational skills. We also do direct instruction in bullying, which typically takes place in the fall. And then we have adopted a curriculum, which is a wonderful curriculum. I really enjoy actually teaching it as well. It's designed to foster self-regulation and emotional control. So even giving more support into what we're doing already in the second step curriculum. Okay, next slide. So when we look at the secondary level, again, they have that framework of PBIS in place, and also have some direct instructions. So you'll see in middle school, there are social emotional lessons and learning that is done in the adolescent studies, and all 6th graders will get that curriculum. And then all 7th graders will participate in a curriculum called Signs of Suicide. And then this year, they used to do advisory as a separate entity, and this year they've embedded it into their social studies class. And so there are a variety of topics that are going through their advisory, as well as, again, organically, things are coming up that their social studies teachers are addressing with their students. When we get to the high school level, The high schools have an advisory in which they do funnel through some of the social emotional learning. We have lots of different clubs and organizations that also foster some of this in our high schools, which is that experiential learning that is happening at the secondary level. So these are some of the universal supports. And now I'm just going to go through on the next slide. There are a few target supports and services. So please know, at every school is staffed with a student services department. That looks differently depending on the level that your child is at. But know that either there's a school social worker, a school counselor, or a school psychologist based in your building. So when we start to look at tier 2 and tier 3 supports where kids just need a little bit more or they're not quite getting it yet, then the student services team member can step in to work with that individual student, or sometimes we work with groups of students that may all be struggling with the same thing or trying to acquire the same skill. There's classroom-based mindfulness going on all over the place. At the elementary level, there's many different apps that we use on a daily basis with our kids. It's a very good practice, and we really are trying to make this sort of a natural thing at the elementary level, so then kids are able to do this when they're in middle and high school. One of the other things that we have started establishing in the elementary level are what we call regulation stations. This looks a little bit different now in the era of COVID, that we can't have a lot of the fidgets and different things that we've had in there in the past. So we've done some virtual work on our regulation stations so kids can take that time to regulate their emotions. At the secondary level, it's just making sure there are spaces for students. Sometimes those spaces may be a spot in the office. Sometimes those spaces may be a student services member's office or area. But we do have spaces for kids to be able to gather themselves. And that's a very important thing. And so when we use these regulation stations, the mindfulness and some of those things, we're really trying to help kids do this in an efficient way so they can get back to business in the classroom. Another tool that we are using for kids that maybe just need a little bit more are the social thinking curriculums, which really help kids learn perspective taking and what is expected in certain environments. It's that social arena is sometimes difficult to navigate even for adults, and these curriculums are really great for us to use, probably sometimes on a tier 2, tier 3 level. So not all students will get this, but it may be targeted to a classroom, it may be targeted to a group. Additionally, we have added the anti-bias building blocks curriculum, and that is being taught within the social studies curriculum. And then we are also piloting a kindness curriculum in some of the JK classrooms in the district. I want you to know that we have great teachers in our buildings, and I can't tell you how amazed I am every day with the grace that they handle any situation that's thrown at them. They are very careful to be looking through many, many lenses while teaching your children. So when we talk about lenses, we're always trying to look through that trauma-sensitive care lens. We're trying to look through the cultural lens. So there's many lenses that we're looking through as we teach social emotional learning. And it doesn't happen within a certain time frame. So it isn't a special. Sometimes that direct instruction is a time frame, but in general, that social emotional learning is happening over the course of the entire day for your child. Okay, next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly Corey, who is a school psychologist, to talk about the academic achievement piece.
Hi, so yeah, my name is Kelly Corey. I'm one of the school psychologists in the district. This is, I think, my 7th year in the district. I work at Roosevelt Elementary, Wilson W. STEM, and Longfellow Middle School. And as a school psychologist in the district, I kind of wear a lot of different hats. So one of my roles relates to supporting, the mental health needs of students. I also work to support the academic needs of students. And then I also spend some of my time working within the realm of special education needs. So a lot of parents talked about concerns that they had related to academic regression and kind of wondering what the school district was doing to help make sure their kids were regaining some of the skills they may have lost or catch everyone up to speed. And I know that's something that is on a lot of people's minds. One of the challenges is that we may not know the true impact that this period of time is going to have on our kids long term when it comes to their academic achievement. But when we focus on the here and now, I think one of our biggest challenges coming into this fall isn't necessarily that learning loss has occurred. It's that students have really come back to us having declined or grown at really different rates. And this is a result of, all sorts of different home learning experiences last spring. There are a lot of variables that went into play that either made that a very successful learning experience for some kids or a really, really challenging learning experience for other kids. So, as we look at, some initial projections by NWEA, they feel that it looks like students of color or students with disabilities were more likely to experience some academic regression from virtual learning in the spring, while some kids who were previously higher performing students actually made gains during the same time frame, especially in the area of reading. Overall, students appear to have shown a little bit more regression in math as compared to reading. So what this tells us is that as we're moving forward and as we're addressing learning needs this fall, it's really essential that we engage in equitable and very intentional practices to ensure that we're addressing skill gaps aggressively as they're identified. This is something that the Wauwatosa School District has been really committed to doing, and that's carrying over into this year. It's going to be a part of every conversation that we have when it comes to student growth. One of our first tasks this fall is to really rebuild that academic stamina. Students are pretty likely to have had some degree of reduced stamina for completing work, stemming from that period of virtual learning last spring. So in these first few months of school, we really need to work to rebuild that academic stamina for our kids. And what that means from a parent perspective is that you don't necessarily need to worry automatically if you're noticing your student really struggling with the workload right now. A lot of our kids are struggling right now just to get back into the swing of things, whether they're in-person learning or whether they're in virtual learning. So the first step would be to make sure you're communicating with their teacher to help them understand what struggles your child has experienced, and then you can get some feedback too on it might be a familiar struggle that a lot of students are experiencing, and if they're not, then you can work together at that point to kind of identify some solutions so that your child doesn't burn out early in the academic year. Another thing that we need to do this year is really utilize those formative assessment types rather than using those broad screening measures like MAP to examine skills. So those traditional single point in time screenings like MAP are just not as helpful this fall for determining the academic risk that a student might have for a lot of different reasons that kind of relate to that variability that we saw last spring. Those tests are not going to be as accurate or as immediate in their utility now. So instead, we're really relying on formative assessment of skills this fall. Things like exit tickets or quizzes or work samples are helping our teachers identify those lagging skills and adjust their instruction to target those foundational skills that kids need to be able to move forward in real time. We don't have to wait for that data point. This year, well, every year, we really focus on differentiation, adjusting those lessons up and down to meet the needs of all students. That's especially important this year, given that really high variability that we have in terms of what students are coming back to us with. We also, are going to be doing some review of concepts and intervention when needed to meet the needs of all of our kids. And this occurs at class-wide level, at a small group level, and an individual level based on that analysis of data. So I'll jump on what Sue said, that we really do have phenomenal teachers in our district. And they're really used to addressing some variable skills at the start of every school year due to something that we call the summer slide. So kids come back from the summer kind of at different places every fall. So in some ways this year is similar to that concept, but it's just a much larger scale. We're looking at a much wider variation of skills. Our teachers are really good at providing rigorous instruction. They differentiate regularly to meet the varied needs of students. They consistently and continuously analyze their student data as it comes in so that they can really adjust and make sure that they're targeting kids where they need to be targeted. We also have instructional coaches and reading specialists. We also have equity coaches in the district, and all of those roles help to support teachers when it comes to analyzing student data and addressing needs. Kind of, again, and it's a tiered approach, that in that whole class level, that small group level, and that individual level. When it's needed, our students will receive additional intensive intervention to boost some of those lagging skills if they're at a significant distance from the rest of their classmates. Because our goal is to kind of get all of our kids back up into a similar level so they can all be learning together. One positive I think that we have seen so far this fall is that those reduced in-person class sizes have been really helpful to teachers in allowing them to focus in on assessing and differentiating to individual student needs. A major thing that we really want to wrap all of our academics around this year is that idea of engagement. Student engagement is really important. We want students to feel like they have a reason to keep coming back for more learning. We do that by providing student choice. We try to connect the curriculum to their interests or current events or relatable experiences they might have. We provide multiple opportunities and modalities to both receive that learning and to demonstrate their learning. We're working really hard to design a welcoming school community, whether kids are coming in person to the building or whether they're learning from home. And the goal of that is to really foster a sense of connection and belonging. And part of that is taking that time to stop and build those positive and trusting teacher-student relationships, and then to, on an ongoing basis, monitor and support our students' mental health and their happiness. So all of those factors that play into student engagement really underlie their ability to be available for learning new information. Another essential component this year is really relying on that homeschool communication to reduce barriers to learning. We tried really hard over the summer as we were planning the school year to predict and remove all of the barriers that we could think of that students might have to engaging with their learning. But as a district, we're humble enough to know that we have not possibly thought of everything. Right now, everybody's circumstances are so unique, and each child is so unique, and their learning patterns are unique. And so if we miss something, and if your child or your family is struggling with engaging or accessing the material, make sure that you reach out to your child's teacher or the school counselor or the principal to help troubleshoot and reduce barriers. So we're here to help. The whole school is here to help. And we do so without judgment. I mean, this is a really, really tough time for all of us, both as students and as parents, kind of navigating that difficult boundary between assisting as, more like a teacher and being more like a parent. So if there's ways that we can help with that, reach out and let us know. I will share just a few brief suggestions for home, and I tried to keep these relatively simple because I'm a parent of 3 young children as well, and I can tell you that I'm really worn out by this point in the pandemic, and I think that's a really common experience right now. So some simple things that you can do to continue to support steps in the right direction for your child's learning are to really commit and make sure that you're spending about 20 to 30 minutes every night on reading. That can be reading to your child reading to you, or your child reading independently. If you're maxed out in the evenings, look to siblings, older or younger, or family members that might be able to connect, maybe via Zoom, and might be willing to read to your child or listen to them read. That too can really increase the motivation for your kids when they get some different faces in the mix. Practice math facts or skip counting on the fly, or play math games at home. Especially when we're talking about the elementary level, teachers can recommend and can send home materials or help you identify simple materials that you already have at home to engage in math games. And these are games that are tied to the curriculum, and kids have often already learned them at school, and they get really excited to share that at home. Look for other everyday opportunities to talk about math and make math a part of your life. So things like cooking to talk about fractions or quantity can be really helpful, or even pretend shopping. If you're doing online grocery shopping right now, your child can help kind of talk about money in that sense, or addition and finding, better deals. So that can be a really good way to just fold that in very naturally. You can look for fun opportunities to write at home. So for younger children, writing letters to family or friends can be exciting, especially when they get the return letter. For older children and teens, journaling or utilizing a gratitude journal can be a really positive writing outlet. You can find free guides for gratitude journals online, or there's affordable journals like that on Amazon or at your local bookstores. It's been talked about already, but I'll repeat it because it's important. Really look to promote a growth mindset at home. In short, growth mindset refers to the belief that with the correct strategies, hard work, and persistence, one can grow their intelligence and skills. A simple way to do that is by praising your child for their hard work and their good strategy selection that they put in to reach their goals, rather than just praising them for their achievements alone. You can learn a lot more about how to parent through a growth mindset lens just by putting it into a simple Google search. There's a lot of information out there. And then finally, touch base with your child's teacher. If your child needs help or is acting overly frustrated or overwhelmed with components of virtual learning, because students don't always relay that information back to school. Students usually save their children kind of save their true feelings for home a lot, where they feel safe and comfortable. So sometimes just reaching out and letting the teacher know how much they're struggling can kind of help to create some solutions moving forward. I think that, overall, this is a really frustrating time for learning for both parents and children when we're talking about that virtual format. But we want to do our best to keep our kids engaged and interested in coming back and maintain a sense of balance so that they're preserving their mental health, because all of those things fit together. I think, most importantly, we have to look at this period of time as a marathon. It's not a sprint. We just need to keep moving our kids in the right direction, keep them interested in learning, and then, they'll continue to move forward, and we'll find ways to close those gaps over time. It's going to take time to identify and close those gaps, though. All right, next slide.
Okay, I'm going to be talking a little bit. Okay, we can do that. I'm going to be talking a little bit about structure, and this is an example of some of the structure we can have. But before we sort of talk about specifically different ways to structure your time, one of the things I think we were all struggling with in the spring, and then on those days when either our kids are home now, or maybe you're doing TOSA Connected and your kids are home every day, is just really figuring out the structure. We know that the way that the human brain develops, that the frontal lobe is the last part of the brain that develops. And that's the part of the brain that helps us to set goals and organize and memorize complex information and to resist distraction and stay focused. That part of the brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s. And so it is important to recognize that your children and your teens do not really have full capability of being able to establish their own structure. So when we do this for them, it allows us to kind of lend to our kids some of our adult brain and sort of our frontal lobe to them. When you think about setting structure, it's important to realize kind of what are your goals for doing this? Is it to support your child's individual choice and freedom? Is it to help your child build their self-help skills and their independence? And is it to help you carve out some time for yourself so that you can do some work or you can have some downtime to do things around your home? There are a couple different ways to set schedule, and two of the ways are both task-oriented and time-oriented schedules. And you can go ahead, we can click on that. Yep. So this is a task-oriented schedule, and if you're interested, they have blank versions of this on this website, Plinkett. So as you can see, this really just has very general goals that the child needs to meet each day, and then it's just a general kind of what are the top few things that need to be done for reading, the top few things for math, an ability to check it off, and it can be done pretty much at the child's flexibility. And that works for some families. Having that flexibility, allowing children to step away for a few moments and to structure their day differently so they can build in more play is really helpful and important for some families. For other families, that lack of consistency and structure can be really challenging. And those are families that might do a little bit better with a time-oriented schedule. Mike, can we go ahead and click on the other? Yep, thank you. So you'll see, again, if you want a copy of that, you can go to plinkett.com. This has some different ideas for younger children and how to establish a schedule. This one is a much more structured schedule and works better for families that work better with increased structure. No schedule is right or wrong for families. It's just recognizing what works best for you and your other needs, as well as what's going to work best for your children. Remember that when you do set a schedule, you always want to have some flexibility. So even within this time-based schedule, you want to be flexible and recognize not every activity is going to take 30 minutes. Sometimes it's going to end early. And there's also an important need for transitions within the schedule. So, try not to schedule your child back to back with activities without having a few moments in between to stretch, to get a snack or a glass of water, just sort of as they do at home or at school, And of course, in any schedule that you're setting, build in lots of unstructured play time. You can build in quiet time where your kids go to their rooms and spend some time quietly listening to music or reading independently. Those are important for your kids, and it's also, I think, important for parents to be able to have those opportunities where they can plan on being able to get some other things done. All right, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so a good rule of thumb is that you should always try to do school before you pull out those screens. And when I say screens, I don't mean getting on a computer for school or playing necessarily like a learning game that's been assigned to them by their teacher, but I really mean screens for play or for fun. So why is that so important? So multitasking is, as you know, the ability to maintain focus in the face of, competing information, other things going on, distractions. That again is a part of your kind of frontal lobe, that last part of the brain that develops. Nobody's actually very good at multitasking, even though a lot of us, myself included, think we're very good at it. But the reality is that almost no child or teen is very good at multitasking. So despite what your kids are telling you, listening to music and doing homework is generally not very helpful. And they've done lots of studies to demonstrate this. They take pictures of kids' brains, like through MRIs, while they're doing two different tasks and trying to multitask. And what they see is that when you have a teen that's doing that as compared to an adult that's doing it, the teen brain is lighting up a lot more, which would tell us that they're working really hard. Their brain is working and putting in a lot of effort. So that means that when teens are trying to manage these distractions like music or text messages or Instagram notifications while they're doing homework, they're actually draining their brain resources that could be used for learning. So one way to manage this, particularly for older kids who are really reluctant to put away their phones, is to have a 10-minute communication window. So pick 10 minutes every hour that they're doing school, and allow them to respond to text messages and to check their social media during that hour. After that 10 minutes though, the phones go back off until they reach the next hour. That's going to really help to increase productivity and to decrease stress. And the great thing is that, as we were talking about with resiliency, doing these different things is also teaching kids different ways to self-regulate on their own. So instead of us sort of taking away their phone or making them do something, this is a good strategy that they can use about how to regulate their own external distractions. If you notice that your child is really resisting the schedule that you've set or the structure that you've set, go ahead and revisit that structure. Go ahead and look at that list again with your child and talk about what your child thinks is doable. Maybe they need more physical help from you, they need shorter activities, or maybe they just need to be more motivated and incentivized to follow the structure. Remember that every child learns uniquely. Some kids want to get their work done right away. Others want to complete a task and then play and then move on to the next task. So just respect that learning process for each child. There is, again, no right or wrong way to do that. But remind them, of course, that adhering to the schedule is helpful for them ultimately. If you run into problems with poor motivation, it can be helpful to create incentives. Thinking about what is it that your child's willing to work for. Is that some additional screen time? Is that one-on-one time with you alone between subjects where they can play a board game with you? Thinking about what it is that your kids are willing to do the work for. And then again, for frustration tolerance, I believe that Sue talked about the regulation station. That can be something kids are really familiar with from the elementary school level and can be implemented in your own home. In my house, we have a little spot under our stairs, and that's become our quiet regulation station. It just has some books, some different dot-to-dot things, a fidget spinner, just some different things to help our kids to calm down if they're getting really upset. For older kids, they're probably not going to want to go sit in a regulation station, but they might be willing to cue you by saying, take 5. And that can be kind of their free pass to step away for 5 minutes, not 30 minutes or an hour, but 5 minutes to calm down, to, get a glass of water, take some breaths before they come back to their work. Next slide.
Thank you, Jenny. Good evening, everybody. I'm Chastity Burmeyer. I'm a pediatric psychologist. Like Jenny, I specialize in working with kids and teens who have chronic health concerns. And for me, that is working based out of the pain clinic at Children's Hospital. But more than that, I think tonight I come as an empathetic parent. I have young children, and parenting right now is incredibly challenging. And I think we've all had moments where, we've been at the verge of tears out of frustration or exhaustion, or, we've snapped at our kids when we didn't mean to. And I think one point that I want to just reiterate before I jump into talking about managing some behavior challenges is I think we're struggling not because we're doing something wrong necessarily, but because this is hard. And I know that Jenny gave some great tips for sort of setting the tone for our day and preventing problems. But we all know that despite our best efforts, outbursts and opposition sometimes occur. So I want to give some information on what to do when that happens, and also talk a little bit about regression. A lot of parents mentioned observing signs of regression in their children or teenagers. Regression is when you notice your child or teen sort of take steps back in their development. Maybe that means they're having behavioral outbursts or meltdowns. Maybe they're clingier or they're whinier than they used to be. If you have a younger child, maybe they're having toileting accidents or using baby talk, or just generally refusing to do their work. And this wasn't an issue before. Regression is actually a normal part of our kids' and teenagers' development because it's really hard work learning new skills, and their brains just sometimes need a break to sort of consolidate all of those new skills. But you might be noticing more regression during the pandemic because our kids' brains are overloaded right now. I mean, they're trying to adjust to the pandemic life, and then also carry on with sort of typical life development. And sometimes this is just more than they can manage in the moment. We know that during periods of high stress, kids, teenagers, and adults all revert to survival mode. And part of that sometimes means that we stop using our like higher level reasoning or coping skills to communicate what we need. And we rely sort of on more instinctual or impulsive behaviors. And so behavior becomes our communication. And screaming at you at the top of their lungs can be a really effective way for your child to get your attention. And refusing to do work is also a really effective way to get a break. So essentially, the general idea for managing problem behaviors is to replace them with more helpful ones, more appropriate ones. We want to replace a problematic way of communication with a more adaptive one. Kids still need boundaries, even during these high stress periods, even when they're stressed. Let them know that it's okay to have that emotion. It's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to scream at you. Let them know how you expect them to behave instead. And I think, this goes back to just sort of relying on your previous parental expectations. What was okay before the pandemic needs to be in place right now during the pandemic. I like to give warnings and then implement a consequence like a loss of privilege if the warning isn't effective at first. It's also really important to validate your child's feelings, again, because behavior is a form of communication. It really helps to say out loud that you understand how they're feeling and that all this change and this unpredictability that we're experiencing is really hard. So sometimes, we need to sort of stay calm as parents. And one effective way that I found is to try to focus on the emotion or the underlying need behind the behavior instead of the behavior itself. Remind yourself that adults have a hard time responding appropriately sometimes. And our kids are still learning better ways to communicate their needs. Sometimes it's easier to stay calm as the adult if you think of the behavior, as a mistake or a learning opportunity instead of like a personal affront to you, even though it feels like that sometimes. You can use your observation of the problem behavior or the regression as sort of an in to talk to your child about how they're doing. For example, you can say, I've noticed you're yelling a lot lately, and it used to be easier for you to stay calm. Maybe we can together figure out a way, together figure out what's upsetting you. I try to avoid platitudes like, it'll be okay, don't cry, don't get angry, because that can seem dismissive to your child. Instead, you might want to try something like, I know it's really frustrating that you can't hang out with your friends right now. Maybe we can do a Zoom meeting with them later. So as Jenny mentioned, giving them opportunities to move toward problem solving, resisting the urge to solve the problem for them, but just, hold their hand and sort of let them find a solution and some control where they can. It's really important to help our kids have some sort of control, especially, in a pandemic where it just feels like so much is out of our control. For younger kids, I really like forced choices. For example, when you're doing your work on Canvas, ask them, would you like to start with math or art first? Do you want to start school now or in 10 minutes? That kind of gets you to your goal, but also makes them feel like they have some say, which can prevent a lot of problems as well. It's important to offer extra comfort or connect with your kids in meaningful ways, especially if you're noticing a lot of regressive behaviors. So watch more movies, give more hugs, spend more time, take advantage of that. I also recommend, we address a lot of the problem behaviors, but it's just as important, if not more so, to reward and praise the appropriate behaviors. So try to catch them making good choices. If they take 5, if they make a good choice to get right to work, make sure that you make a big deal of that and you really put on a lot of positive praise or reinforcement. That's going to look different for every child. So whatever, motivates your kid is the thing that you'll want to really emphasize in those situations. I like the book, Homework Without Tears. It's an oldie, but a goodie. It's a great resource for giving specific bullet points. It's not a burdensome read at all, but it has a lot of great information for managing school-related behavioral refusals. So that's another area you could check out if you wanted some more information. We know that the pandemic has really thrown a wrench in our ability to connect with others. So Kelly's going to come back and talk a little bit about this next. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about social connection because we got a lot of questions related to social connection. And concerns from parents, especially those who are learning in a virtual format right now, because it's been quite a long time now since their children have been in school with their peers or had access to play dates and things like that. And the concerns really ranged from worried that their kids didn't have enough opportunities to connect socially, that they were feeling lonely, or kind of worried because it seemed like they were not all that concerned that they were no longer in close social contact with others. And then also sort of those feelings of missing out or feeling like, others are out doing things without you when you're learning from home. So I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about the difference between social isolation and loneliness. So social isolation is a very objective term, and that's really just a descriptor of the number of people you have around you. Loneliness, by contrast, is a very subjective term. So loneliness is described as a discrepancy between the connections that you need and the connections that you have. So because it's such a subjective term, it's really a different experience for all of us, from child to child, from adult to adult. What will make us feel lonely is very different from each other. It's also not entirely dependent on the number of people that you have around you. So people can feel very lonely when they're surrounded by lots of people, and people can feel pretty content when they're spending a lot of time by themselves. It really has to do with kind of that gap, your own personal gap between the connections that you really feel like you need and the connections that you have available. So because of that, I think right now it's really important to make some time to just sit down and talk with your child directly about what their individual needs and wants are when it comes to social contacts. And if there is a gap that they're expressing, if they are expressing feelings of loneliness, spend some time problem solving together to close that gap. So in essence, it's not an automatic cause for concern if your child doesn't seem all that concerned about a lack of close social connections outside of the home right now. And similarly, if your child is back in school and seems to have access to peers regularly, they may still be having feelings of loneliness. feeling lonely from time to time isn't necessarily a problem. But when you have long-term feelings of loneliness, that can put a person at risk for different mental health issues, things like anxiety or depression, some sleep disorders, stress, and low self-esteem. So it's just a good time right now to check in with your kids, ask how they're feeling, if they're feeling content with their current social connections, so that if they're not, you can really partner with them and brainstorm different ways that they can increase their social connectedness during this time in ways that are both safe and satisfying. It's important to consider that right now, social connections may just look different for a while, and they can still be rewarding, and they can still trigger those same pathways in our brain, those same reward systems that make us feel good. We have to look for alternative opportunities to socialize with peers and family right now. So even before this pandemic hit, I think this generation of children was far more adept at connecting with their friends digitally. They might connect with each other, I guess rarely probably using phone calls, but more often using text messages. Facebook Messenger Kids has a way for kids to connect. Social media for our older teens and older kids, things like FaceTime or interactive video games can really reduce those feelings of loneliness for kids. And because this is a component of their generation, it may feel more natural and fulfilling to them. And this is where having that conversation with them is really important, because it might result in bending your expectations around screen time for a while. So if they're really feeling lonely and they've got some strict rules around screen time, which are generally very good and very encouraged, it might be necessary to adjust those if they're identifying that these are the ways that they're going to feel more connected to their peers. You can also look to open up their options for connections. And, again, encourage them to take those risks when it comes to opening themselves up to connecting with others. So you might be asking the school what kinds of opportunities are available for extracurricular activities or clubs that really match your own family's comfort level for risk and exposure. I know that some clubs are, meeting virtually right now. Some are in person. So I think there's a lot of different pathways right now that you could explore that maybe you didn't need to before. I know some families are really looking at the idea of pods or social circles with a fewer number of close friends, or finding ways to engage in with other families or other friends in a socially distanced way, often outdoors, feels a little bit safer. So depending on your family's comfort level and individual circumstances, you might be able to identify one or two other families who share similar views to you and similar practices on social distancing that you might feel comfortable with opening up to, so that your child has, at least a one or two options for social connection in that way. So, especially if you can find families where you might get along with the parents, that can, to bring into your circle, that can provide both you and your children for some meaningful opportunities for social connection. And as a parent, give you a little bit of a break from kind of being that constant source of connection. I know that some families and students that are in that virtual format are forming pods right now, learning pods, which means just hooking up with, one or two other students where you're coming together to complete that virtual learning together. So obviously there is some risk involved there, but probably less so than opening up to a whole classroom of kids. There's other, socially distanced outdoor activities and games to explore. So things like hiking with another family might be a good way to get outdoors, move, and have some of that time to talk from a distance. Or neighborhood games of like charades you could do from driveway to driveway. So it gives you that same chance to laugh and share that human experience with other people while still doing that in a manner that feels safe to your family. as you're seeking out, or if you choose to seek out social circles like that, be really upfront about your own family's efforts and their needs related to social distancing. There's a lot of different, health issues that individual families might face, or different comfort levels. If you can share what you're doing and what you feel comfortable with, and gather that information from the other family up front, it can reduce some of those feelings later on. If there were to be a mismatch in risk taking, you might feel less awkward or less uncomfortable about bringing it up in the moment. You can kind of set the tone up front for what is comfortable and what's safe for your family. If your children are learning from home and they're currently feeling left out, watching their friends play outside or knowing their friends are at school, it's really important to make some time to have regular open discussions about your family's decision and the positive impact on others that their sacrifice is making. So for example, they might have family members who would be at a high risk of complications from COVID-19. So learning virtually for now might allow your child to continue to interact with those family members. How you frame this time for your kids can have a really positive impact on how your children view these difficult choices. And that can be empowering and uplifting for them. It's also important to acknowledge, again, how difficult this is, and that it's okay to feel sad and upset and left out sometimes, and that we're all kind of struggling with those feelings. Again, that validation piece is really important right now. Another thing that you can do is make sure to be setting aside some intentionally and mutually enjoyable family time right now. And I think the key word there is mutually enjoyable. As I mentioned before, I think our energy levels are lower. So like in our first week of distance learning last year, we were making butter and doing all kinds of crazy activities. I'm not really at a place where I have that kind of energy anymore. So when you're finding things that are mutually enjoyable between you and your child, where you guys can both kind of engage in that idea of play, it's open-ended, it's free, it's something that you all enjoy together. It's going to be something that doesn't feel like one other thing to check off your list to make sure your kids are doing all right, and more be a break for everyone together, where you can feel that social connection with each other. Obviously peer interaction holds a special place in the realm of social connections for kids, but having those connections with family members is really important as well. It's that social connectedness that we need as humans, and we can play a really big role as parents in fulfilling some of that. You can also reach out to other family members, see if you can get people to engage in some virtual calls, have sidewalk chats, things like that you can also do to spread that out and kind of increase social connections in a safe way. The good news is, for the kids that have come back to school for in-person learning this fall, by and large, we've seen them jump right back in with their peers and are doing really well with their social skills. We're seeing really great things out of our students, and it really just showcases their resilience. It's awesome to see. So I think the same will be true for our kids who are still engaging in virtual learning for now. I think they'll bounce back. I do want to take some time, though, to mention some special considerations. And this is special considerations for our students who have disabilities that have a particular social impact. So we know that when we talk about social skills regression, these kids are particularly at risk because for them, these students and families really rely on the social interactions and the direct teaching that occurs through school as an integral part of their social development. So for these families, again, that close and frequent coordination with staff at school can help to share resources back and forth, and then create some continuity in language and approaches between home and school. So even if they're not getting that same level of opportunity for social practice at school, they might be able to help you guide some things that they're working on that you can continue at home as it comes up. So some ideas to practice social skills at home. Parents and family members can work on body language and conversation skills in the context of their day-to-day interactions. But it's important to note that when you do this, it's important to focus on just one element at a time. So you might just really focus on body positioning or gestures or active listening or taking turns in conversation. Just kind of work on one skill at a time so that it doesn't become overwhelming. Children can also practice these skills from a distance with neighbors or by video or telephone calls with family members. Another helpful activity for at home is watching movies or TV shows together, where you're able to stop every now and then and analyze the interactions or the phrasing or the facial expressions of the characters. That can be really helpful for kids to start to pick up on some of those social detective cues. Writing letters or emails, whether they're writing or someone is scribing for them to family and friends, is a really nice way to slow down conversation and give you an opportunity to step in and guide some of the expected give and take in a conversation. So at the end of the day, none of this is a replacement for full-time peer interaction in schools. And we are likely to see some regression in social skills by the time this pandemic is behind us, particularly in some of our higher risk students. But engaging in these small activities that reinforce the skills where you can are going to help narrow that gap as we move forward through this difficult time period. And go to the next slide.
Thank you, Kelly. Many parents had questions about anxiety and depression, and I'm going to start with anxiety, and I'd specifically like to start just by clarifying stress versus anxiety in kids and teens. I think of stress as a physical or emotional reaction we have to a challenge or just something that we need to do. We actually need a healthy amount of stress. If we didn't have any stress at all, we wouldn't be productive. We really wouldn't be compelled to get anything done, which is why your teen might sleep all day during the summer. We need a little bit of stress to prompt us to work and plan. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is the reaction we have to stress when either we feel like we can't meet that challenge, or we overestimate sort of the threat of that challenge. So for example, if your kid has a meltdown or they can't sleep because of a test just in the morning, that anxiety is sort of an out of proportion response to the task or the thing. Some signs of anxiety in younger kids may include physical complaints like stomach aches or headaches. They might have trouble sleeping, might cry easily. They may ask a lot of what if scenarios. They might worry more often than they don't worry. You might notice some reluctance to separate from their grown-ups, tantrums, or just maybe some silly behavior, or just a lot of reassurance seeking from adults. A lot of that is true for teens as well, but you may see more avoidance or procrastination, withdrawal or anger or irritability in that age. We know that kids and teens can also experience worry and anxiety specific to COVID-19 or the pandemic. That might look a little differently. It might look like increased focus on their body or their health, excessive worry about the virus. They might have some physical changes like just different appetite or changes in sleeping habits. And many of the coping strategies that we've already reviewed tonight can also help with anxiety, such as building structure and routine, helping to promote resiliency or a growth mindset, and just in general, helping your child to learn to tolerate distress and uncertainty by focusing on what you can do in that moment of worry instead of what you can't or what's out of your control. It's always a good idea, even though it sort of goes against our instinctual behaviors as a parent, to try to avoid constantly reassuring your child's worries. Instead, point out what your family is doing to take care of yourselves. In the case of COVID worries, you might point out, we're washing our hands, we're wearing masks. Always encourage your child to ask questions and gently correct any misinformation about the virus. Remind kids that experts and doctors are working really hard to learn about the virus and how it can be treated. Try to avoid exposing younger kids to adult level media coverage or news coverage about the pandemic. Try to help your child change their worry or their anxiety into an actionable goal. For example, if they're worried because they don't understand an assignment and they haven't heard back from their teacher yet, help them to kind of move into problem solving mode, help them make a plan of action. And again, you want them to sort of take the lead on this, but take a break, email someone else, work on another task while you wait to hear back. Really take that as an opportunity to build in flexibility and problem solving skills. And worry makes us feel like we can't overcome the issue. So it's really helpful, and something rather simple is just to remind your child of a time that they successfully tackled a similar worry or challenge in the past and what worked for them. What did they learn from that experience? That can be really helpful. Next slide, please. Just like anxiety and stress, depression is different from sadness. Like Heidi opened with earlier today, this evening, many of our kids are grieving and they feel sad about all the changes that have happened because of COVID-19. And loneliness and loss of normalcy just really contributes to that sadness. Some ideas to help with COVID-related sadness. You can try distraction with learning a new hobby or doing something, a well-loved hobby. Think about limiting social media or news intake. That's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to stay connected, but you don't want so much that it makes you feel lonely, or you start getting into a part where you're comparing yourselves to other people. You can also practice finding something you appreciate in the current circumstances. We've been talking a lot about growth mindset, and I think that might be the theme. But an example is extra family time. And really focus on connecting with others in a safe and meaningful way. We want our kids to have real, honest conversations with their friends and family about how they're actually doing and if they're struggling. Now is not the time to sort of put on a mask of positivity or just say, I'm fine or I'm okay. If they can be real and they can be vulnerable with, a safe group of people, that can really buffer against a lot of sadness related to the pandemic. We know that it's normal to feel down and discouraged, especially now in our current circumstances. But some signs of extra struggling or signs of depression you might want to look out for include sadness or hopelessness that just hangs on. It lasts for weeks or for months. A marked decrease in low energy or motivation, poor concentration, more physical symptoms, and or withdrawal. We want to watch out for those things. For both age groups, we start to be concerned about anxiety or depression if the symptoms get to a level where your child or your teen can't live their life as they want to, or they can't function as they want to. If that's the case, you may want to reach out to your child's pediatrician for resources on how to get more support and what the next steps might be. A lot of this really involves just giving yourself grace as a parent. If you yell at your kid, it's okay to admit you're impatient and you didn't respond well to being frustrated, and ask to try again. Frustration, stress, and worry are all very normal emotions that we're all experiencing right now. And some of the best coping lessons that our kids can learn is just watching how we handle ourselves when our emotions get the best of us. But we know that just implementing that and modeling those techniques is really exhausting sometimes. So Heidi is going to come back and give us some ideas for having a greater balance as a parent.
Thanks, Chastity. You can move to the next slide. All right, so just like we were talking about, I think modeling is so very huge when it comes to big emotions, anxiety, even like a couple of our fellow speakers have mentioned tonight, which is just this idea of it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay that the level of patience, the level of tolerance that we have now at this point in the pandemic looks different, feels different. Our kids know that. They feel it. They sense it. We do too. And I think there's a lot of power in just naming it, call it out. I'm sorry, mom, dad, you're grown up, right? Today is a rough day. I'm so sorry. I'd love to be able to try again. And again, that modeling is huge. One thing that I kind of like about some of these anxiety tips that I'll walk through with you now is that this doesn't necessarily just apply to parents. I want to talk specifically from a parent perspective about some of these, but just again, a reminder that this is modeling and our kids will see these things. They will maybe even pick up on some of these great habits, and we can work on them together. We can become stronger together as we learn how to function in a healthy way during a really difficult time. So the first thing that I'd like to say about anxiety is that I think it sort of goes back to that perfect storm, right? We have grief and loss, and then that wraps up into this cloud of anxiety that sometimes follows us around. And when we are grieving, when we have lost something, we feel this lack of control. And so a great thing that we can use to kind of ground ourselves, remind ourselves that there's this idea of a lack of control, and we can decide what it is that we choose to focus on. So know what you can and cannot control. Obviously, we cannot possibly control every outcome, but there is the ability to make a conscious effort or to put specific focus on what we can control. So what would that look like? When we talk about something from a very cognitive behavioral perspective, which is something that we do in therapy, we can apply these principles to work with kids and parents alike. It's something I do in my practice a lot because I believe in the power of it. We can really start to become aware of our thoughts. What am I thinking right now? What is kind of that automatic negative thought that comes up for me when my child doesn't want to do their work? When I notice I'm losing sleep at night because I am concerned that they may be regressing, or I'm really concerned that they didn't want to hang out with this friend, that they seem to maybe be pulling away or isolating a little bit from peers, right? Those are the things that keep us up at night. And we can't necessarily control all of those situations. We can't be there with our kids in all of their peer conversations as much as we might like to be, to help them along, to fix it for them. But again, coming back to this question, grounding ourselves, what is it that I can control? One thing we do have the ability to control is our thoughts. So a nice reframe, changing from those automatic negative thoughts to something that is either positive, or if we can't quite get to positive, let's sit with neutral. Neutral's okay, right? As we've said so many times tonight, this is really hard. And maybe we can't get to this kind of ideal perspective that we'd like to be able to say everything is great and we can get through this and I'm not going to lose sleep about anything. There's nothing for me to worry about. We may not be able to live there yet, and that's okay. That's okay. But instead, maybe that thought that we shift our focus to looks something like, if I am able to manage my anxiety, I will be modeling well for my kids how to navigate their own anxiety. If I am able to talk with them about these peer relationships, I think it was Jenny who mentioned earlier, and instead of kind of jumping in and talking at them or suggesting the best route of action, ask questions that will help guide them to the right answer. And so if we're able to shift our thoughts in that direction, I think that really is effective for this idea of a lack of control and how we can really ground ourselves in focusing on what we can control. Another thing that I think comes up a lot with anxiety is it can be very fear driven, right? So this idea of fear and facts, this can be incredibly helpful for, kind of taking an inventory of what you're currently believing to be true about what you're currently experiencing. And I think that can be really helpful. So being mindful of this difference, asking yourself perhaps, what is it that I'm really anxious about? Do I have any evidence that supports this fear? Maybe you do. right? One thing I really loved, Kelly talked about it earlier. She talked about this idea of, we have these fears of regression, of what does academic achievement look like right now? And she mentioned that there is truly kind of this reduced stamina. And so kids are coming back to school with maybe a little bit of difficulty focusing, or a little bit of difficulty engaging in the same work cycle, right? So the time period in which they work might look different right now this fall than what it did prior to the pandemic starting in March. So I think, when we look at it from that perspective, we may have evidence that says, yeah, absolutely, I can see the evidence of this reduced stamina. Okay, so there's your evidence, right? That's what you're anxious about. There's your evidence. And then, if necessary, create an action plan. And one of the things that Kelly mentioned was reaching out to a teacher, connecting with someone from student services, and being able to say, here's what I see. Here's what I know about my child, what I know to be true, and how they maybe normally are functioning and how they're functioning now. So again, really deciphering the difference between what is my fear, this fear of regression, what is the evidence that I have, and then how do I move forward with that. There may be times where we get a little bit more caught in this cycle and don't necessarily feel like we have such a clear-cut answer. Maybe we get stuck at the what am I really anxious about? And we're not sure because there are so many variables. Or maybe we try to find evidence that supports the fear, and we're just not sure because it feels as though there is so much evidence and we have trouble kind of deciphering what is real or what is imagined. And I think that speaks to just, again, this level of energy that we have as parents throughout this entire experience. And as it continues to persist, we will have days where staying in charge of our own emotions will be difficult. And I want for all of us to be able to give ourselves grace on those days. There is no perfect parent ever. There certainly isn't a perfect version or method of parenting during a pandemic. We are all doing the best that we can. And I think if we are able to work through these coping skills and maintain this idea of remaining connected to our kids, modeling healthy functioning for them as best we can, when we can, and apologizing and repairing the relationship when we feel we've been unable to do so, that is what will really help us, kind of persist through this, even in the midst of some of these very big feelings, like some of this anxiety. Another idea that I really love when we're talking about anxiety is the idea of staying in the present. So often we have a lot of what if thoughts, and if we're not careful, those can really take us down a rabbit hole. So my child has the sniffles today. What if they aren't feeling well? What if this is something that we need to worry about in terms of whether or not they're able to go to school? Or do we need to call a pediatrician to talk about testing for COVID-19? What if they're falling behind? What if they're not engaging with their peers in the way that maybe other peers are? What if they are anxious? What if they are depressed and I miss something? Those what ifs, again, those are the things we lose sleep over at night. They can be big and scary, but we can manage them. Remembering that we can choose also to focus on the now, right? So what if turns into, here's what I see. It's kind of like collecting that evidence again. So what if my child isn't engaging with her peers the way that others of them are? What if she's kind of on the outside of that bubble? Maybe her social skills dipped a little bit more than other students in her class. And I think when we're able to focus on that instead of, I think when we're able to focus on the now instead of the what if, that can be really helpful. So in that situation, it might be maybe we intentionally engage that child in more socially distanced play groups, if that is something that we have available to us, and if we really do feel that there is a risk there for maybe some of those social skills to be farther behind. there are so many ways that we can kind of apply this what if and the now that for me, I think it's almost helpful to have it sort of tucked into the back of my mind, like a mantra or a catchphrase. When I start to notice that I start to go down that train of thought, what if, what if, what if, what if, it's a reminder to say, what is happening now? What is the now? How do I collect that evidence? How do I collect that data? How do I ground myself in this? And again, kind of going back to the fear and facts, if that what if proves that we maybe do need to change course a little bit, we can always come up with that action plan. And I'm so thankful that Sue and Kelly have been able to be here from Student Services and show us the ways that we can reach out for that support, as well as just give examples of how it's happening in real time in the schools. So I think that's been really helpful too. Another thing that I think can be helpful when we're thinking about anxiety is the reminder of what is possible, what is reasonable, what is realistic. There are lots of things that haven't felt as though they fit into those categories, especially in, the last several months. But I think as the pandemic continues, we've had this unique experience of being able to kind of learn from our own trial and error, learn from the experiences of those around us, whether it's friends, family members. We're able to see what works. So I've been impressed with the creativity that I've seen within our school district. I've been impressed with the creativity that I've seen among friends and family members. There are still lots of things that are possible right now, even in the midst of kind of difficult to navigate times. So when we think about school, someone had shared with me an anecdote that at one of the schools they drove past and they saw that the children were outside for recess playing tag, and they were using pool noodles to play tag. So they weren't touching each other, they weren't close to each other. And at the end of it all, one of the teachers or the support staff had disinfected those pool noodles, right? So these are the things that are possible. These are the things that we can explore and discover if we open ourselves up to the idea that we can be creative in navigating some of these anxieties. We can be creative in navigating these situations. And that's incredible. So maybe more is possible than what we tend to think when we're wrapped up in these feelings of anxiety. What is reasonable? So I think that this kind of speaks to some of that mitigated risk when we maybe decide that we have 3 or 4 families that we feel comfortable seeing in a socially distanced setting. We intentionally sort of expand our bubble to include those individuals. Like Kelly mentioned, maybe from the get-go, you have a conversation about what everyone will be doing in terms of the precautions that they're taking to avoid any fallout later. Those things are reasonable. Those are things where we can expand what we have maybe been doing. So as we think back to maybe March, April, even May, we may have been restricting ourselves and our interactions a little bit more, but as this continues to persist and we notice maybe this anxiety is a lot, this anxiety is kind of impacting our functioning either as parents or as a family system. Maybe we see it impacting our kids, and then we decide whether expanding our bubble is a worthwhile risk, right? Is this reasonable? And then realistic. So I think this can be difficult to navigate for kids, especially now, because sometimes we are not in the same learning modality as maybe our friends are. So one may be in Wauwatosa Virtual Academy, others may be in TOSA Connected, and still others may be doing phased into learning, and trying to match some of those schedules maybe has some challenges if we are looking for ways to connect our kids, right? Reduce our anxiety by connecting our kids, because this is what we feel will benefit them and what will strengthen those peer relationships perhaps when we're very worried about them. This, I think, can be more challenging, but not impossible. So when we're managing our own anxiety, what is possible? What is reasonable? What is realistic? What are the things that we can do, concrete things that we can focus on, right? So it goes back to that piece about control. What are the things we can control? We can shift our thoughts. We can become exponentially creative. Again, it's exhausting. Some days we'll have the energy for it, and some days we won't. Some days what is possible, reasonable, and realistic will look different than other days. That's okay too. Which brings me to, I think, maybe the most important point about this slide, which is focus on taking care of yourself. Parents, you are so important. You are a priority. And I know that we are in kind of this headspace where we feel as though our kids and their needs always need to come first. But that's not true. You can't pour from an empty cup. And when your cup is empty, your family will feel that. So you can choose to have control over that. You can choose to have this positive ripple effect kind of go throughout your family. When you're taking care of yourself, they will feel the benefits of that. If you're not taking care of yourself and you have not filled that cup through self-care, they'll feel that too, right? We may be more impatient. We may have more times where we break down and we are short-tempered or we are impatient, and we have to do more of that repair to the ruptures in our relationship. I know that it feels maybe at times like an impossibility, but I do promise you that if you are able to find ways to make yourself a priority, the whole family will feel those benefits. It might look like something that fits into this possible, reasonable, and realistic. Maybe it doesn't look like going to the gym like you used to. Maybe it doesn't look like meeting friends for coffee like you used to. Maybe it does. Either way, I don't believe that there's a right or a wrong. I think it's what works for you, what's best for you. It could even be little things like making sure that that cup of coffee or tea that you have, whether it's in the morning or the afternoon, is hot when you sit down to drink it. Not that you've had to rewarm it in the microwave how many times before you actually get to sit down and enjoy it. Those are little things that you can control, that you can do for yourself to show some self-care, to make yourself that priority. Something that I find incredibly helpful when thinking about self-care is kind of focusing on just the very basics. What does your sleep look like? What does your nutrition look like? Are you drinking enough water? And are you moving your body, right? Even in just a gentle way, light stretching, a yoga class, taking a walk. And these are things that our kids are going to see, right? They're going to notice that we are making time to take care of ourselves. And it's important. It's the most important thing. We can move to the next slide. And this was an example that Sue had shared with us that I just love. So I won't say a lot about it, but it's such a great reminder, right? So just this idea, like you get on the airplane and the flight attendant's giving their whole song and dance, and they remind you if something should happen, you really do need to take care of yourself first, right? Before you're taking care of others. And again, I think that kind of speaks to just the importance of self-care and the priority that you are within your home. So Sue, I'm going to let you kind of finish up here for us, I think.
Okay. I feel like we almost need to take another deep breath. We took one before we started, and now I think we probably need to take one as we wrap this up. One of the things, we can move to the next slide. One of the things that I really think about, and we hear a lot of this, is we're all in this together. And I think it has become sort of a catchphrase, and sometimes we are just like, oh my gosh, if I hear that one more time. But I do truly feel like being connected to your community, to other families, to the school is really, really important. And so if your family is struggling, if you as a parent are struggling, if your student is struggling and you have concerns, I typically will direct parents to contact your pediatrician. You know your pediatrician. Most of us trust our pediatricians, and they have lots of resources and different places that they can send you for assistance, or maybe can assist you right then and there. Secondly, I think it's really important to know that we have these great, amazing student services staff members in all of our buildings. So feel free to look up those people. could be a school social worker, a school psychologist, or a school counselor. We can also help you hook you up with those resources. For me, if I'm looking for a resource for my family or my family's having an issue, sometimes it's really daunting for me to make all those phone calls to try to figure it out. But that's what we're here for. We can call some of those places for you. We can make that pathway to support easier. So please feel free to reach out to us. Additionally, we have this wonderful resource in our district, the Student Family Assistance Program. That program is also available to help students, parents alike. Often I will recommend parents just go and you go talk to them because again, it comes back to that if you're taking care of yourself, you can be the best parent you can be for your child. The Wauwatosa Student Family Assistance Program will also help refer you to places. So you don't have to Google search, like, where do I go to get help? They have people that can help you as well. So if you're more comfortable calling them, feel free to call them. I added the Children's Mobile Crisis Team. It's formerly was known as MUT. This is a mental health based team that when you are truly in crisis or your child is truly in crisis and you don't know where to turn or what to do, you can do a phone consultation or they can come directly to your house to help you sort through things and assess the situation and then give you the direction where you may need to go with your child. And lastly, Impact 211. It is always the number that we give parents as a resource. For any sort of resource, you can call or email this number for Milwaukee County to get resources in the area. I guess I'm going to I think maybe Mike is going to come back on, but I really want to thank everybody for hanging in there with us. And I hope that the information that we presented tonight was valuable in some way, shape, or form.
No, Sue, I really want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Jenny, Heidi, Kelly, Sue, and Chastity for their time this evening. A lot of work went in this beforehand. And, you know, when I really think about how vulnerable, selfless, supportive, positive, student and family centered that all of you were this evening, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the school district and the community, because I know, as I said at the beginning, it has been a lot for our families. And just to know that there are people in our community who care enough to spend time of their own to help us through it. And then also, I really want to thank Sue and Kelly for really embodying what we have within our school district, which I think is fantastic, and just a great group of individuals who are tirelessly working behind the scenes to support students and staff, and that's really our student services team. So, like I said, thank you to everybody for your time. I know we will continue to think about how we best support each other moving forward. But most importantly, thank you to our panelists for everything that you gave this evening. It really was, like I said, inspirational and very, very helpful on so many levels.